Hi, I'm Lenice Brothers, a registered nutritionist, women's health, hormone, and menstrual cycle coach, and the founder of Eat, Love, Move, a nutrition and well-being practice. This is the Period Story Podcast, where in each episode, I sit down with a guest to talk about their period story. We get behind some of the myths and misconceptions about periods and so much more. Now, on to today's guest. On today's episode, we have Sarah Greenidge. After working in healthcare regulation and communications for some years, she decided to broaden her horizons and started consulting for consumer health and wellness brands. Coming from such a regulated healthcare space where evidence-based information is king, she was concerned about the quality of consumer content in wellness and that brand partnerships were largely based on popularity and not necessarily expertise. After raising these issues to a few people working in the industry, she was met with a response that the industry was different and doesn't need to be strict with what they say. It was here that the mission to tackle this mindset was conceived, and a year later, Sarah started the WellSpoken mark. Welcome to the show. Let's start off by getting into the story of your first period. Can you tell us what happened?
Yeah, so I was 11 years old, and I remember coming downstairs of my parents' house. I have this very vivid memory, and going into their conservatory. It's very specific. I remember this, and I remember feeling something in my underwear and being really shocked when I looked and saw that there was blood. And it was a real distinct memory for me, because I was kind of really overwhelmed. I remember just kind of doing nothing for a couple of hours before then I told my mum what had happened. And it was interesting when I saw the question, in terms of thinking back, trying to unpick what that 11-year-old Sarah was thinking. And I think it was a mixture of shock and, interestingly for me, somehow shame, interestingly. Which is why I didn't say straight away. And I've been trying to think about why that was. I can't piece together that 11-year-old mind now, because I feel obviously so differently. But that was kind of an important part of not saying.
How long did you wait until you told your parents?
It was a couple of hours, definitely. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And my mum was completely normal and like dealt with it beautifully. That was a real internalized feeling, because it didn't match my mum's response, if that makes sense. But that to me is really interesting, that is something that I had a view of that for some reason at 11 years old. Yeah, which is sad, actually, when you think about it.
Do you, thinking back on this feeling of shame right now, do you think that it was because of the way that periods had been spoken about at the time, things you had heard at school?
Yeah, I think definitely so. And I think at the time, girls were starting to get their periods at school. And for some reason, it was talked about very negatively within that kind of. So that would have been, I would have been year 7 actually when that happened, which is the first year of, I don't know if it's middle school or high school or wherever you're based. And yeah, at the time, socially, for that group of 11-year-olds, it was talked about very negatively. And I remember specifically hearing about another little girl who had period already, and I remember going on a school trip, an overnight stay, and this girl very just normally sharing that she had started her period quite early, in what I thought was early as a 11-year-old. I think she was 9 or 10 or something. And the reaction of the girls in the room was really kind of one of almost shock and horror. And that really stuck with me then when that happened to me, I think. And it's interesting even thinking about that, because I haven't thought about that for 20 years. But yeah, actually, it was really interesting. It was just how in that little baby kid society, it was seen as very negative, and I think maybe dirty, without saying those words, because you don't have that language at 11. But that was the kind of sense.
Thinking about it now, how long did it take you to move past this feeling? Or on the other side, have you moved past that feeling?
Do you know, actually, I think I moved past that by the time I was probably 13 or 14. And the reason is that at that point, probably a lot of the majority of the young women I was around at that time had started their periods, and then the stigma, just because everyone had it, dissipated, if that makes sense. There was no longer this, it was just a normal part of our lives. It wasn't something that we spoke about, but it, you know, it no longer had that sort of reaction. And then, you know, and then onwards, it was spoken about quite freely, because people would use that to get out of swimming and PE class, and then it became this empowered thing that we use to, like, can't do this because of my period. So it's interesting that in 2 to 3 years how the transition happened, where the society I was in, or where I was living.
So going from being the shock and horror to being this empowerment and using it as a tool to manipulate teachers.
and then there was no problem talking about it whatsoever. You know, and that's, I've never really thought about that, but there must have been a transition in those 3 to 4 years, because I was still in the schooling system at that point.
Right. And the girls were talking about it so freely. What about the education in the school around it?
I don't remember really anything particularly. I'm sure there must have been, but I have no memory whatsoever, outside of maybe when I got a bit older. The first time I remember really talking about periods, maybe I was in primary school, but it was all very kind of anatomical, and I didn't really understand, I think, at that point. And then the next time I really probably kind of got education about the reproductive system, I was in college. I was in A-level biology probably. And I didn't, and that's because I took that course. But I don't remember, even in we had a thing called PSHE. I don't know if it exists anymore. It's kind of like your social class of, like, culture and what happens in the world. And often they talk to you about sex at that point. And I remember more distinctly it being about sex safety and safe sex than about biological function of your body. There was never really that focus. So I did a lot of learning much after.
So your own personal learning.
Yeah, and even thinking about I don't even really remember much family learning either. And I don't want, the thing is, I don't have memory of it. It doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it obviously wasn't enough for me to stick into my memory. I think it was brief and fast, you know. So I think that's interesting. And then I did my own learning, you know, kind of 16 up.
And so how did you learn? Internet, books?
Internet. Mostly. At that point, this is when you could get on to, this was not to show my age, but this was the start of when you could get internet on your phones. It was the first time. It was about 16 or 17, and it was slow. And, like, just going on the computer and, like, looking. And what triggered me to look, actually, was I used to get, and still do sometimes, but nowhere near as much when I was in my teens and early 20s, really bad headaches around my period time. And because I didn't have cramps so much, it was the headaches before I would come onto my period. And because I found those so debilitating, and then it could trigger a migraine, I was seeking solutions because of that, in which I then did more learning about periods and your reproductive cycle, if that makes sense. But it actually wasn't because I was looking for information. It's because I had a symptom that I needed to kind of get under control or think about how I could manage it. I was looking for, like, ways to stop your headache, you know, that kind of stuff. And that's what prompted the learning.
So what did you end up do to stop the headaches?
It was a lot of trial and error. I did every kind of changing foods and diets that you think of. I then, where I kind of started to talk more to my family, is actually what I found out was that that was something that on my mother's side everyone had, from mother to grandmother to really bad headaches. And so whether there's a familial link of perhaps that's something how our bodies respond, or to the hormone change. And it made me kind of understand a bit more about what happens before your period, if that makes sense, in that phase.
Yeah.
And trying to manage those hormones, trying to get more sleep. And, you know, it was kind of lifestyle changes that I did
Yeah.
to try and to be honest, I'm going to be honest, I did a lot of stuff in my late teens, early 20s, and not much worked. It was a real combination. And then as I started to get older, that started to go away, which my mum told me it would. She said that that was something that happened to all of them from their teenagers to their kind of early 20s, and then it shifts. Your kind of, I guess your body goes through like a shift in terms of how it manages the hormones. So yeah, that was how I kind of managed it. But I still do get that sometimes now. And it's very stress related and it's very sleep related for me.
How has it been in the last 3 months?
To be honest, I also, on top of the complication, depending on where I ovulate, what side, what I've noticed to really get to track, I either get, depending on the side, I get quite bad cramps and no headache, or on the other side, I get not very many cramps and headaches. And it will alternate the month for me, actually, on what symptoms I get. And it took a long time tracking that. And I think over the last 3 months, I've had pretty, bar the last one, I had pretty bad periods, in terms of quite a shift from my norm. In terms of symptoms, there's a couple of things that I know for sure is, one, I think just a lot of heightened stress.
Yeah.
I think with just this lockdown and all that kind of stuff, and I found that I'm working a lot and not able to switch off because I'm working at home. You know, you don't turn off.
Yeah.
So it's like a heightened level of stress all the time. What I have done is, and also bad sleeping, also super bad sleeping. And that has had an effect. What I've really done over the last month, when I thought I need to get a grip on this, because my headaches can last 2 to 3 days, is I've upped my exercise quite substantially and dropped a lot of sugar from my diet, which what I realised is in tandem with lockdown, I started to eat badly. You know, it compounds.
Yeah.
And then it has an effect. And then my last period was much better, because of like taking quite proactive action and sleep.
Yeah.
And I think that's the real trigger for me, really. And it's been interesting. I've been relatively okay. I would get the odd bad period here and there, but I could tell you why that was. You know, normally I could say I had a terrible week of sleep, I was just super stressed, or I ate really badly that month. I could, really pin it down. So I think lockdown has a lot to do with it.
It's interesting that you have such precision now in the way that you track your menstrual cycle, and you can say exactly, well, this is what happened to me in that week, so this is why my period, or this is like this, or this is how I feel, why I felt like this. Can you talk a little bit about what you used to track and how you said trial and error? So what were the kinds of things that you tried to get to that precision in tracking?
So it almost took a while back. So I, as in terms of a career, worked a lot in pharma, and I actually ended up training to be a sexual health advisor, and I worked in sexual health for a long time in HIV. And so through my work there, I became super aware of your reproductive cycle as a woman, and just more au fait with stuff that I had no idea. And I think that's the key thing, is that most of us know very little. And then I went on to work with some of the big health tech giants who do tracking for fertility, and got into working in fertility and IVF. So that, what was really great with that is I suddenly became aware of the science behind reproduction, and also how we as women can have cues that we don't necessarily pick up on. So, one of the things that I really did was first, and is a friend of mine many years ago who told me to do this. She goes, every day, write down, and this is before the apps, write down how you feel, and if you have any symptoms, just like bullet points. Not enough sleep, slept well, what I've eaten, if I ate anything unusual, that kind of jazz. And it took me about 4 months of doing that consistently to then start to pull the data and look at patterns. And that was commitment. And I kind of in my mid-20s. I was also then a data geek, so that helped with trying to find patterns and sequences. And in terms of the trial and error, there were a lot of things I thought I saw as patterns that turned out over the years to not be, and things that I put very little onus on turned out to be, for me personally, in my body, tend to be quite big factors into how I am. And so, I think that the key thing that has, the hardest thing for me has been the food.
Okay.
And eating well, because that takes a level of discipline, and you have to, I guess you have to be so cognizant, and it needs to become a practice that when you're eating something or whatever you're doing, to link this in your brain as a connection to how this can affect your menstrual cycle. And sometimes I don't have that, to be honest, and I regret it after. I should have thought about that. Where I have got better is with the sleep, really, because that's linked to functionality as well. And also what was really helpful was I tracked a lot of my symptoms pre-period, for me to know when I was gonna come on. And there's a lot of cues then that I now pay attention to, that I would think, oh, I've just got this ache, or for instance, I know probably about 3 days before I'm about to come on, I struggle with, I know restless leg is like controversial, but I feel my legs, I've got almost like, not cramps, but like I feel restless in my legs at night.
Right.
That is like, so I know at that point, that means that my period is coming. So all these little, whereas before I would pin that down to maybe exercise.
Right.
But actually I know the difference between a DOM feeling of exercise and this kind of deep ache, which is slightly different. It's not painful, it's more kind of uncomfortable. And then things like breast tenderness, kind of aches in your back. But it took a long time of writing those down, and not every month was the same. That was a key thing for me. So it took me quite a long time to work out what, some months I get something and some months I don't. I'm not actually very consistent, if that makes sense, with my symptoms. I know some people are like, when I've talked to friends, they're like clockwork on, they get this pain here and then this happens. Whereas for me, it really much depends on how I've lived that month. And yeah, so it's just getting really au fait with my body, actually, and being able to get to know my body and then sense what is happening.
So this journey of you getting comfortable and no more knowledgeable about your body, what else has it changed for you?
I think it's made me much more, really good question. I think this could sound strange. In general, it's made me more conscientious as a person, as a weird side effect, because I think a lot of the time we live life on kind of autopilot. We kind of go through and just live, but by trying to stop and be present and think about what's happening has spilled over kind of into other areas of my life. Weirdly, I never thought that was be like a symptom, but it's made me much more cognizant of how other people could be feeling. That sounds strange, but it really has made me think about, being more in tune with my body in terms of, sometimes I can feel really flat some
Mm.
days, like zilch, nothing. And that's different phases of my period. I can feel like that, just absolute numbness. And I can and I'm quite a highly motivated person. And so that's a real drop for me in terms of my personality, and I can't get out of it. But sometimes when I encounter people and I see them in that mood, it makes me empathetic in a way, because it's made me think about what they could be going through, not necessarily menstrual cycle, but in terms of our mental health and our emotional well-being.
Mm.
And I think that it's made me more hyper aware of the kind of mind-body connection. I
Yeah.
think, as a weird, like, life symptom of being more in tune with your menstrual cycle.
Yeah. You said that it makes you more empathetic to what people are going through. Does it change the way that you interact with them?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things that has definitely come out of even trying to manage my own periods and trying to figure out what's happening is patience,
Mm.
and exercising that. And I'm somebody that wants the answer yesterday. Some actually you can't do that, because sometimes, if I have something that feels a bit odd, I don't know the reason straight away. And then actually that I would get very frustrated by that. And actually that is indicative of probably who I was as a person, as a
Mm.
personality. And that's made me, really think about, in the way that I interact with others, to have that kind of patience and compassion, that sometimes things are happening and people don't know why, or
Mm.
people might be having a reaction or an exchange with somebody that you find frustrating, and to think more about, why am I getting this reaction? What is stimulating this, as opposed to being just immediately reactive.
Yeah. I want to just go back to the tracking because
Yeah,
I think that it's something obviously that I encourage all of my clients to do. It's you get so much valuable information, data,
yeah,
whatever you
yeah,
want to call
yeah.
it.
That's the geek story
um,
in me.
if someone's listening and they think, "Yeah, I know I need to do this," how do I do it? What would your advice be based on your experience?
Yeah. So at first, I would say, find a method that works for you, in terms of that is the ease of tracking. So whether, because I think one of the things that with tracking I find important is that you need to be consistent. Otherwise, you won't get that. You're not going to see the data. I say data, but you're not going to see the patterns if you like miss 3 days. Within, you know. Within a 3 day period, there can be such valuable information that happens in those like 72 hours.
Yeah,
So you need to be consistent. So if you're glued to your phone, get an app of
yeah,
some description, or do it in your notes. If you're a journaler, write it down. But I find that when I was doing this years ago, I was doing this manually, which took a lot of effort. Now there's loads of apps that allow you to just tick boxes, for
yeah.
instance, that they've taken up the arduous labor of it. So you can, like, track it. And I would encourage people to do that.
Mm,
um and in that way you just build that habit. And the key thing is just try and do it for a month,
yeah,
1 month. And that's, to be honest, it's enough sometimes for you to motivate you to do it further. But I think it just brings such valuable information. So I would say find the way to track.
yeah,
um I the one thing about tracking, even though I'm a data geek, is I think you need to track what is intuitive to you, as opposed to trying to tick some boxes. Because actually, when I first started, the best advice I got is just track what you feel. And I know that sounds vague and annoying, but that gave me the freedom to put down things that seemed innocuous, that then turned out to be really important. So, you don't have to put how many hours sleep. It doesn't have to be that prescriptive. I think it's just doing it what works for you. If you just want to track, your mood, or you want to track, biological, physical symptoms, great. And I think that that's super important, to not be so rigid that you don't do it.
Yeah.
And it becomes too labour. Any data is good data in my book.
I just have this vision of you with this massive Excel
No,
spreadsheet.
there was an Excel sheet. There actually was.
Brilliant. That is brilliant.
And I think what motivated me is because if I hadn't had symptoms that really annoyed me, or I found debilitating, I wouldn't have had that motivation, I don't think. But because I wanted to really get to the bottom of these headaches, out came the Excel sheet.
Yeah, with like pivot tables and
correlating dots. Yeah.
I want to shift gears and talk about your work and the company that you founded, WellSpoken. Mark, talk to us about why you thought this was necessary and the steps that you're taking at the moment.
Yeah, sure. So, as I kind of mentioned before, my career was working in the kind of medical healthcare setting. I worked with a lot of pharma companies and NGOs and healthcare institutions to do work there in terms of improving people's health in specific disease areas. I then became a consultant at a particular point in my career, and I stumbled into working for someone that needed help with some consumer health stuff. So this is the stuff that kind of comes out of the really hard regs that comes around pharma and medical stuff that, is kind of a bit more life and death. And this was more in terms of just healthy living. And when I kind of looked at the content people were producing, I was really shocked at the standard, because evidently when you have really hard legislation in place when it comes to sharing information about, prescription drugs, you have to be by the book, because there's no room for someone to misunderstand a dosing, because the consequences are so huge. Your communication has to work for everybody. Everybody needs to understand precisely what you're saying. And what I found is, because there wasn't that rigor, I felt in the kind of more wellness consumer field, because actually the results and the outcomes aren't so serious, it seems. And that's what I would say. It doesn't seem like it's that serious, on the outset. But what I really believe is that health is 360, and I really believe in preventative health. And I think healthy living comes under that. And our society is really focused on treatment rather than prevention. And that reflects in how we treat information about prevention. And that we kind of, it's very laissez-faire. And so I saw that there was a lot of just crap being started out by brands and people on social media, and it was chaos. And I thought, we need to figure out a way to bring some of the rigor that we have in the medical field into this field, because it's equally as important. If you take on the wrong diet regime, or you exercise incorrectly with poor form, you can hurt yourself. So it is important. And so there was the spark of where WellSpoken Mark was founded. So what we are is a kite mark, and we work with brands to ensure that the content they're producing hits a certain credibility standard before it goes out to you and I in the consumer sphere. And we worked with two universities, one in Barcelona and one in Sheffield. They've both got health informatics departments, which is super, that's a whole other world, and that looks at the way that we as humans now interact with health information, especially online, and the way that consumer trust works. And they might seem like really odd like buckets, but actually the way that we engage with health information, our guard is down societally in a way that it's not when we're dealing about, let's say, money. So I'll give you a kind of a classic example. I did a focus group, and a lady talked to me about, she signed up for a meal prep service that was being advertised on Instagram. Loved it. She said she couldn't sort out her food. She just wanted to hit her macros and all that kind of good jazz. And she signed up via a promotion on Instagram. She signed up with some influencers code, and it was mighty expensive. obviously per month. You're talking like in the hundreds in
Yeah.
terms of like to do that. She then said what she then realized is at the same time she was looking to lease a car, and actually same amount of money per month, but she was going into the fine print of that leasing contract. She was looking around at different vendors to see what she could get the best deal, and her approach to spending her money in terms of a car was so different to the way that she literally clicked a link and paid hundreds of pounds a month via social media to improve her health, as it were. And that's a classic example of where we are as a society at the moment. Now, that's the way that we tend to have low guards when it comes to health information, which is why we absorb a lot of misinformation without fact checking credit. It looks glossy on Instagram. We just assume everything is above board. And because of that, and because our health literacy, which is split into two parts, our ability to understand health information and then make an informed decision with that information, as in the UK, globally, but in the UK specifically, is quite low. Even though we're quite a developed country, if that makes sense economically. You would think that those two go hand in hand, and they don't. What that means is that as a consumer base, we don't have the skills yet, and it's also often we're not taught those skills, whether it be in school or whatever, to decipher good and bad health information. We think it's really important then, if you are a producer of that health information, that you need to take that on board, and you need to think about how do you make sure that whoever's your audience doesn't misunderstand the information you're putting out, and then doesn't do something with that information that then is detrimental. There was a real big move in terms of clean eating a couple of years ago, and then what you had is a real spike in orthorexia, for instance, which is being obsessive with healthy eating. Or you had that when people talk about mental health, there's this kind of the naturalist movement to like not taking any medication. But actually, if you have a serious mental health condition, suddenly not taking your prescribed medication because you see kind of this move on Instagram is not ideal for you. And, people are making health actions without checking with health professionals, because we have this kind of peer-to-peer learning culture in health. Actually, that's great, but there's some negatives to that. What's really important for us in terms of working with wellness brands, with all that considered, is then thinking about when you're communicating with your audience, you need to think about their health literacy rates, but also what impacts them. And our kind of next big thing that we're kind of engaging brands in is to think about health inequalities when it comes to different socioeconomic groups. And actually race plays a part in that. And we've had a lot of talk about the lack of kind of diversity in wellness. And although that from a social perspective, that's not great in terms of to not represent parts of the community, it actually has health implications, because if you look at the data, health outcomes for Black and minority people are much lower than white people in the UK. And part of the reason for that, there was a real big move in the 90s and early 2000s that it was due to cultural and genetic factors. I put in inverted commas. But what we now know is that racism and discrimination plays a part in the way that people can receive health information, they seek help. It's all bundled into one big snowball. And if you're sharing health and wellness information, it's important to think about everyone in your audience, not just people that are necessarily wealthy or highly educated or have more social mobility. And so our kind of next big thing is engaging wellness brands to sign a diversity charter, which makes some commitments to improving diversity in the wellness industry, which will have, I hope, better implications in terms of making the wellness industry more representative of the population, but also actually on the content they produce, bearing in mind those factors for their audience.
I want to go back to what you were saying about health literacy and how in the UK, you would assume it's high, but it's actually quite low. And you talked about this peer-to-peer learning culture around health. And what's really interesting is there's a lot of statistics that show that amongst Black people, trust in doctors is actually quite low. And so how do you connect this idea of low trust in doctors with lack of health literacy, but also this peer-to-peer learning culture?
Yeah, so I think oh God, it's big to unpick. I think the first thing, so there's multi-layers to it. So you're absolutely right. That is a big ball of kind of like chaos, because you have all those elements playing at one. I think for one is to really unpick why there's this low trust with healthcare professionals. Often that's generationally passed on. I'll give you an example from my own family in terms of how that is positioned. Um, it actually does come from a place of personal anecdotal experience often. That often, if you look at the data in terms of people's experiences, what you'll find is they say they've had a very negative interaction with a healthcare professional. They have perceived that to be because of who they are and their skin color, and they've had poor treatment or poor interactions because of that. And obviously, no one's going to go back to somewhere that doesn't engage you or interact with you well. So I think on that level, we need to ensure that healthcare professionals are proactively and very visibly making those changes to build that trust with those communities. And I mean, unfortunately, it's live and kicking today. Even when we look at the Embrace report in terms of women dying in childbirth, five times more likely if you're Black, and then even with this COVID situation with BAM groups dying disproportionately, there's a lot of work to be done there. And I think one of the key things that healthcare professionals can do is they need to engage with community pillars. To have conversations, to bring them into the community, to be seen as a safe space. So where it comes into social peer-to-peer learning, what we have in the community, I think, is some brilliant networks in terms of people that are connected to each other, sharing information, and healthcare professionals need to tap in. And I think also the leaders of those networks, or people that are influential within our kind of Black community in terms of on social media, who are kind of driving a lot of the conversation, I think also need to have it's a mental move rather than anything visual, a move to actually not seeing themselves as influencers or just information sharers, and to see themselves as information providers. Okay. And when you make that shift in your head, there comes a level of rigor, because now, as a responsibility, as a person who's sharing information, and that your sphere of influence is quite big, and that people will take your information and run with it. With that responsibility, then we need to employ some of the practices that we see in other institutions where there's liability. So that means providing things like references, moving in from sharing to education. And it's a really subtle shift. It's not necessarily something that you need to do a song and dance about. I think it's just the way that you communicate and focus on upskilling and improving someone's health literacy. Because when we talk about health literacy, particularly in wellness in general, but also in wellness more niche in the Black community, what you'll see is people will recommend something, and because of groupthink in the way that we kind of interact in a social setting, people will have an understanding that this is healthy for me because of something. They're not quite clear when you ask them, why is that healthy? They just know that it is. Yeah. And then they'll then do it. But that's low health literacy, because that means that you can't explain why you're making those choices. So we need to plug where we know those gaps are to make sure that you communicate to, I always say, is the lowest denominator, not the highest, not the most educated person in your audience, the person that doesn't know anything. And that's actually where you need to be based. So I'm hoping that it's going to be a compound move, as opposed to one thing within the Black community. But I think I think there's that kind of a growing acceptance now that, and the science backs us, that this myth that, and there are some things that are genetic in all race groups, so not just Black community. You look at people of Chinese origin, there's some very specific disease pathologies they have there. In, for instance, certain ethnic groups, there's genetic stuff. But we need to kind of move away as a community to think that everything is cultural, or everything is food-based, or everything is diet-based. And once we kind of acknowledge that there are some socio-economic, cultural aspects in play at why our health outcomes are worse, that helps us automatically do better.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned going from an information sharer to an information provider, and I think what's really interesting about that is the idea of referencing is really powerful, but there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that comes out of working with people, and you see patterns. And sometimes I just want to talk a little bit about this, because sometimes in the science-based community, you see a lot of negative commentary around anecdotal evidence. Talk a little bit about your opinion about that.
Yeah, so, I think, I personally think anecdotal evidence has a huge part to play in terms of looking at data and clinical decision making, I actually think, because anecdotal evidence, a certain level of anecdotal evidence is required for you to see a pattern for you to do a clinical study. So actually it's the precursor to what people see as the most rigorous, data-driven analysis, but it has to come from somewhere. You're not plucking it out of thin air. So I think there's a move, and can I use COVID as an example to talk about where this negative connotation of anecdotal evidence has big health implications. So one of the things that I really believe is that science moves faster and information moves faster than we could ever publish it. So just because something's not published doesn't mean it hasn't hold truth. We just haven't had 18 months to run a study. It doesn't mean that it takes a long time. You need funding, all that kind of stuff. That doesn't mean there's not truth in something. And one of the real going back into geek mode, one of the real interesting things for me in terms of looking at COVID was looking at how we got to where we were in terms of big spikes, and people were looking for hard data. And actually, if you look at some of the explanations from the way that the WHO, and they're great, so it's not to criticize them, I think it's more to do with the culture. When doctors were reporting incidents of these weird cases, because it was only anecdotal, it wasn't taken quite seriously enough until you hit a number which was deemed to be important enough to take action. Now, I think in terms of that, having markers is super important, I think, when it comes to things like medication and things that you're ingesting or consuming, because evidently there's safety, associated with that. So I think there's a place for having very clear parameters before you make claims around certain aspects of health, that we have to have them. Otherwise, we're going to get into people being quite ill. So that's not to say that that's not the case. I think by not having a positive view of anecdotal evidence, we actually rob ourselves sometimes from foresight and looking ahead at where things could be going, because we're waiting for things to hit a marker when we know it's happening. And I think I'll give you an example in terms of more the wellness field. Is one of the things that is quite interesting, and we don't have a lot of data on it, but we know it as a trend, is that in some meditation practices, what we have seen is, from kind of clinical kind of small studies, is that for certain meditation practices, for certain people with certain mental health conditions, can actually exacerbate those conditions as opposed to make things better. Now, what has happened is, because we've had a universal communication that meditation and mindfulness is brilliant for all, that has been the kind of narrative. Anyone can do it. I'm thinking about all the messaging that we've seen from the big wellness brands. We didn't have in the Western world so many people doing it en masse, so we didn't have the data. But when we did start to see some negative effects come out of very niche groups, this was an example of where actually people didn't wait for 10,000 cases of this before issuing that advice, and we took anecdotal evidence quite seriously, and then made policy change within, for instance, institutions in terms of thinking about people with certain mental health conditions. So this is where there is a role for anecdotal evidence. What I always say to people in terms of, especially when you're working in well-being, where, let's be honest, because there's no funding, pharma's not going to fund a well-being study in terms of, like, you know, there's no product at the end of it, let's be honest. You don't have the data because it doesn't exist. Who's going to fund it? What I always say to people is those markers are there for a reason, because it's a safety thing. However, it doesn't mean that you can't share. So I just think what we need to do is just be clear to our audience that it is anecdotal evidence. And that is the way I think we have a good middle ground, where we can still share the experiences of people, but we say, look, this is what we've seen as patterns with the people that we work with, for instance. This is not indicative that this is a health claim, that this will be for you, but it's something to consider. And I think it's about toning down the language all around health claims and absolutes. So what might work for someone might not work for you, and then positioning things that do, especially based on anecdotal evidence, is where we just need to be careful. But there is a place, 100%. And I think we need to, once we accept that science is, I know it sounds strange, science is not all knowing, and science shifts. What was in, you know, I was a microbiologist by trade. It was funny, I was looking at my old textbooks from 10, 12 years ago. They're outdated. I can't even give that to anybody that's studying now, because the information there is, we know more. And actually, it's not relevant anymore. So I think if you kind of see science as evolving and as an evolving feat, anecdotal evidence has a role to play.
I want to talk about the diversity and wellness project that you're doing. So it's a really important topic. There's a lot of conversation about race and Black Lives Matter right now. When will this be out, and how can people connect with it?
So the charter goes live on June the 15th, Monday, June the 15th. And, you know, it's super important. So we know that, you know, within the wellness field, and you and I have spoken about this before, it's there is a certain aesthetic, and there is a certain kind of elitism that is class-based also. That's important to say. It's class, and then race kind of comes under that. And you have in a place that's supposed to be very inclusive, actually has become not very inclusive. So to really challenge that, and to challenge the people that I would say that run the scene, because they've got the money behind it, they're the powerhouses, the brands. What we're calling for is brands to commit to 5 pledges. Now, what they cover is, you know, corporate diversity, making sure that they're internally hiring people that are from different ethnic backgrounds to widen the perspective, especially within health. Education, so when you get the staff, actually educating them on what we talked about in terms of health inequality and where race plays a role, and how you have to adapt your marketing strategies as a company. Fair pay, making sure that people are paid equally. That's a problem in the scene, unfortunately. Access, let me get it up. I missed one, sorry. You might have to edit this. I forgot my 5 pledges. Representation, so making sure that people are represented and seeing themselves in the scene. And then the last one is all around access. So trying to make things more accessible for more people. You know, when you have high price points, actually this is done very well in other fields, and it's not necessarily that you always have a reduced class rate, for instance, but there's other strategies you could do. Pay it forwards. There's lots of ways that, you know, wellness brands can, you know, even if they are at a high price point, think about supporting communities and low income communities that can't get in, all that kind of stuff. So what we're asking brands to do is to sign up to these pledges, and then do the work to actually, you know, implement those in their companies. So the way that it will work with us is, if you sign up as a brand, we will do an audit of where does diversity sit in this company at the moment? What does it look like? And then we will work with them to basically put a plan together that works for them, that's authentic, that's organic, that's not just, you know, optical allyship, that's just not performative, but that actually, you know, has meaningful change. And a lot of that probably we won't see, if that makes sense. You know, it's internal changes. And then we will do annual reviews of how those changes are taking place. Because, you know, it's quite a big structural shift.
Yeah.
So I think at the same time, we need to give companies time to make those changes in a really authentic way and not in a knee-jerk way. Because actually you end up getting things wrong when you do things in a reactionary state rather than a really considered state. And so what we're asking people to do when we launch is, in the link in our bio, what we will have is we're hoping to do a pincer movement, and I think this is what's going to bring about change. We will have the charter, which we're directly approaching brands to sign up to, but then we're going to have an email template that people in the community, people in wellness, can copy and paste and send to their favorite wellness brands to say, have you signed up to this charter? We had over 150 now as of this morning, wellness, Black and minority wellness practitioners or professionals working in the field sign up and give their support to this charter. And so for me, it's of the people and it's for the people, if that makes sense. That this is what we are, as a community, are calling for. And then, if we mobilize both ends, it puts the right amount of pressure, I think, on brands, that this is something that consumers want. They want this transparency and they want things to change when it comes to racial equality.
And for all of you who are listening, we'll put all of the links to the charter and the email template in the show notes. If listeners take one thing away from all of the brilliant things that you've shared with us today, what would you want that to be?
So I would say to everybody, think of your health literacy as a core skill of yours. And actually, we all have, as we've gotten older and grown up, come out of school, had to learn about financial literacy, had to learn how to interpersonal skills, how to maneuver through the world. And often, just the way that society has been, we've neglected our health literacy. And my real passion project is to get people to think about that as a core skill of theirs, in terms of, especially if you're very engaged with your health, it's really important that you make informed decisions about your health that are right for you as a person. And we see lots of trends and cool things that go on in health and wellness, but the key is deciphering, is that right for you, and what's going to make your life better and your health better. So I would say, look into your health literacy. We're shortly going to have a test, and I'll send you the link in the bio of how you can test your health literacy. So you can see where you are, and it gives you a good gauge on how you can think about that. So that was what I would say, health literacy all the way.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for coming on to the show, Sarah. Can you just tell the listeners the link to the URL of WellSpoken, Mark?
Yeah, absolutely. So our website is www.wearewellspoken.com, and on all social channels, our name is WellSpoken Mark, so it's the same across all platforms. And you'll find us most live and kicking on Instagram.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. For more inspiring conversations, head over to periodstorypod.com, where we have so many more for you to peruse. If you want help with your menstrual or hormone health, email me on hello@eatlovemove.com to set up a free 30-minute hormone health review. If you like today's show, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Tag us, come say hi, and send in your requests for who you'd like to see on the show on Instagram and Twitter on @periodstorypod, or email us at hello@periodstorypod.com. I'm Lenise Brothers, and you've been listening to Period Story. Thank you so much for listening.